I would like that we are convening this space from Minnesota, which is the homeland of the Dakota people, and where Dakota and Anishinaabe people, as well as Indigenous people from other tribal nations currently reside. And as we're discussing nature-based solutions, I think it's important to acknowledge that many of these solutions draw off of traditional ecological knowledge of Indigenous peoples of the region. So today you'll get to hear from our speakers for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes, so a nice long time for Q&A for you to grill Ted and Will. And then everyone online can leave and enjoy the rest of their day, and everyone in person can enjoy the delicious treats and a small group discussion. So we are recording this, as you just saw, and we will send it out to everyone afterwards. If you have questions during the presentation, if you're in person, you have a little note card to write all your questions down. If you're online, please drop them in the chat, and my colleague Rachel will look out for them, and we'll do Q&A at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Will and Ted to introduce themselves and start the presentation.
Cool. Be speaking through your laptop, yeah?
Yep.
Perfect. Hey everybody, I'm Ted. One of the co-founders of Ecotone Analytics. Will is our chief economist and will be mainly doing color commentary and backing me up as I wander through the presentation we've put together for you. So Will, jump in if I misstep or if you have any other good jokes. So yeah, I think we're gonna share the presentation here on the screen, which I think we can see.
All right.
Cool. Yep. So we're talking about nature-based solutions here today. So this is kind of a primer on that, and yeah, that's our logo. And we move to the next one.
Right. Some of the tech is me controlling this now, so any problems with slides, it's on me.
Cool. So what is an ecotone? An ecotone is a part of nature. It's a biological term that describes when two different biomes overlap. So think of when the forest meets a lake, or when a desert meets a meadow, or any place where two different biomes overlap. And in that, there are usually the most diverse number of animals and plants, because there are two different biomes overlapping. And in that as well, there are opportunities for unique species that only live in those areas. So pulling from that in our name, I guess you can come to the next slide. What is it? Who is Ecotone Analytics? That's me and Will, Tim, Steph, Daphne, Seamus, Kime. There's almost 10 of us now. We've been doing this for about 9.5 years. And really are using that blending of two different biomes. We're using frameworks from maybe traditionally nonprofit ideas, but also business understanding and the language of business to help translate some of these concepts of impact into useful understanding for business to move forward with. So we usually work with Fortune 500 companies, but we really put our teeth with service provider nonprofits and academics to help better understand the methodology over the years and create an auditable, transparent way for the work to be understood. So yeah. An example of this is we worked with a global food chains finance and sustainability teams. First of all, to really help them talk to each other, facilitate that communication, because at some points, the finance teams can kind of be like, we gave marketing a bunch of money and you're asking us to plant a bunch of trees. Why don't you just go talk to them? Not realizing that this is really an opportunity for them to make an investment and to get a return and understand their supply chain better. And so through our cost benefit analysis and the frameworks we use, we help them, kind of identify and understand the risks, and again, translate it into the language of finance for their teams to think about the return on investment over time and the benefits and to whom those accrue, like the ranchers, the local communities, the franchisees, and the corporation itself. Yeah, so help them break that stalemate and move forward into pilots and action instead of a circular conversation about whose department it should fall in. Yeah, so natural capital, what is that? It is the the earth, you know, it's the soil and the air, the water, the living creatures. You know, it's really the physical environment in which we live in. And in a lot of ways, it's priceless. You can't really put a number to it, but to a certain extent, our human brains and our capitalist system need a number put to it. And so part of what we're helping everybody do is to just better understand from a numerical value what some of these systems do for us as a society. And so I have a couple examples here of the street trees in California being worth $2 billion in cooling. And then, you know, there's mangrove forests in Mexico that are helping their economy by $70 billion. And, we'll dive into a little bit about how to break that down. It's kind of a concept. So then you get into nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions are solutions that are relying on nature or pulling from nature to help solve some of the issues that our current system have created. And so looking to what nature has done to clean itself up naturally over the evolution of it, and pulling from that, scaling those opportunities, or in a lot of places reintroducing the same idea back into places that have already had them. So examples of that are sustainable forestry, regenerative agriculture, you know, green storm water infrastructure. And so, yeah, these practices, again, are somewhat pulling from the past and then mixing in some new understanding from the present. So, you know, you can have regenerative practices with Internet of Things, tracking the soil moisture and the carbon sequestration of different plants or crops, you know. But a lot of it seems innovative and new, but is actually pretty understood and old for other communities who haven't just run through everything. But yeah, maybe we'll go to the next slide. And I feel like I'm running through these fairly fast, so we might have more than 30 minutes to talk. But
Woohoo!
right, so now we're going to get into more of the implementation kind of understanding. So we thought it'd be cool to talk about a couple of examples that we've worked on over the years. One was with a local group called the Friends of the Mississippi River. And they were asking us to look into continuous living cover crops and perennial grains that you don't rip out every year, right? You can have them come back and they work into the winter months. So, and maybe Will, you have a much better understanding of this project, so maybe I'll throw it to you.
Sure. Yeah. Well, we like this as an example because in many ways the idea of continuous living cover is meant to reflect a more natural system, right? Because in a natural system, you wouldn't have millions of acres of annual crops that would leave the ground bare for half the year, which is kind of standard operating system at this point for much of the agriculture in Minnesota and the upper Midwest in general too. So the idea here with these crops that are being developed is to get back to being able to reflect a more natural system while still developing these crops that have a revenue attached to them as well too. And so as a part of the project, we went through and we're exploring what types of benefits could come from implementing these types of cropping systems. And within the table here, you see that there's multiple benefits. There's both some big environmental benefits that come with it. And from those environmental benefits, we can see a variety of social benefits that can come with that as well. So things like reduced nitrogen loss, that has implications for drinking water, for surface water quality, things that can impact our health. But then we also see on farm, there's this opportunity for increased revenue and potential increase in profitability for growers too. So this is one of those where the ability to reflect a natural system using this new portfolio of crops and crop management techniques has the potential to be a win-win scenario in this case.
Thanks, Will.
Yeah.
Another newer local implementation of coalition building around, the opportunities for nature-based solutions is the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Hub that is being put together. And Will, maybe you can speak a little bit more here too.
Yeah, sure. Well, continuing on the idea of the continuous living cover, so we saw the various benefits that can come from that. Although our work on that was particularly focused to the on-farm and near-farm implications. But when we start to see the value chains that some of those crops, some of you may have heard about these, things like winter annual oil seeds, where within the visual here on the left-hand side, you'll see a category of feedstocks for the fuel that's called regenerative crops. So that being some of these crops that are being developed at the University of Minnesota here. And these crops have because of the fuel that they're replacing, so this being your petroleum-based aviation fuel being the norm, right? If we're replacing some of that petroleum-based fuel with fuel derived from our regenerative crops like winter annual oil seeds, there's a big carbon benefit that can come from that. So significantly lower carbon footprint attached to a sustainable aviation fuel that's coming from a regenerative crop rather than a fuel that's derived from petroleum, right? So this being one of those examples, it's still being developed, of course, but we're basically seeing this nature-based solution for agriculture being integrated into a whole nother value chain, the jet fuel value chain. So we're having benefits both on farm here as well as cutting the GHG footprint for our flights, right? So we like this because it just shows another win in an already win-win scenario that's being derived from trying to get back to a more natural system.
Will, I think you know more about this project as well. So
Yeah, sure. So switching gears a little bit in terms of types of projects. So the ones we were just looking at are primarily sustainable ag related. But the same idea of the value of a nature-based solution is common in the forestry space as well. So we've been working with a group that many of you are probably familiar with, Sustainable Forestry Initiative. They're the folks who are developing standards for management, as well as they create the certifications that you can see in a lot of forest-derived products like paper and cardboard and wood and that type of thing. And so in many cases they're doing that same process of working to improve the sustainability of forest management by taking a nature-based approach, because by doing that, they're able to generate this series of benefits that otherwise lost in a less sustainable management practice. So that being things like clear cutting forests that can have potential negative implications for water erosion and soil erosion and so forth. And SFI has been doing has developed this program too, where they work closely with indigenous communities across the US and in Canada, and really working to engage them and learn about the different practices that they're using as well, and integrate those practices into the standards that SFI has been creating, so that there's this opportunity for the different indigenous communities that are managing forests to also get this certification, and having that certification aligned to the traditional knowledge, as well as the indigenous rights too. So by doing that, we're getting this combination of benefits again, these different win-win type scenarios, right? And to continue the example of the role of a nature-based solution in forestry, that those products, those forest-based products can be included into many different types of value chains, right? As we know, wood is everywhere around us, right? And one of the areas that's been getting a lot of attention, one that you've probably seen a bit as well too, is the use of mass timber buildings. So this being buildings that are typically bigger than like a single family home, right? That are using an engineered wood product in place of concrete and steel, which would be our typical materials used for larger structures, right? And so the idea being that there's a variety of, negative environmental implications that come with concrete and steel production. As you all are probably very aware, the creation of cement and concrete has a pretty substantial GHG footprint. So the idea of taking a sustainably managed forest and using the wood products from that forest in place of concrete has kind of a double whammy GHG benefit where we're sequestering carbon within the wood itself and we're reducing the demand for the cement and concrete at the same time. So we're getting this this dual benefit, right? So that's another example of how these nature-based solutions can be developed in a forestry application and done so with that intentional environmental justice approach attached to it as well, in this case focused on indigenous communities managing forests. So that's another example that we have going here. But I wanted to highlight just a final sentence that we've included on the slide here where in terms of the different organizations that you all may work with, this being one of those examples where the nature-based solution doesn't have to necessarily be something that you are doing at your company on site, right? It can be built into the products and materials that your company uses, right? So in this case, we see this nature-based solution being implemented by and supported by a third party like SFI, who's working with the forest managers and the lumber companies. Those types of products are often out there and they can be ones that can be intentionally incorporated into your own value chain.
Cool, thanks, Will. So yeah, where does this fit into carbon reduction, right? And I would say, it's a yes and situation in which carbon reduction is more thinking about now, and nature-based solutions tend to have a longer return, both in their societal and environmental impacts. So if you're making investments into these areas, reducing the amount of carbon that an organization uses now is important because we're rapidly putting a lot of it in the atmosphere and it's creating climate change. And so we need to slow that down. So anything we can do right away to do that is good. But longer term, some of these more nature-based solutions have a bigger impact, but they take time to grow. Like literally, you're planting trees, and you can't just take their benefit tomorrow. So it's a part of a portfolio to use both of them to work in your strategy. There's also kind of a cognitive trap that people can fall into, the perception of investing in the business solution or giving money to environmental sustainability initiatives. And you can do both, really, right? So it's like materiality. What is material to your business and what is material to the types of externalities that your organization is creating through the products or services you offer? And so in doing an inventory of all those externalities and assessing risk with each one of them, both in how impactful they are, negative or positive, and how much they take to clean up, or if they're like, there's only one chemical that does the thing that your product does, like, then you can either put a lot of work into researching a new or different alternative, or just finding other ways to extend its life cycle or clean it up after it's been used. And yeah, the idea that companies want to be around for 100 years means that they want to have customers and an environment to live in. So all of this work is helping them reach that goal. And yeah, really, it comes back to this idea that we live in a capitalist system and there's a financial return to a lot of these, and you do need to take that into account because companies do need to make profit and pay bills and employees and all that kind of stuff. And so, we feel that being able to connect the benefits and the research that have been shown in different academic studies to the bottom line, business value and an ability for the people who are making decisions at a high level for the corporations to just better understand what the potentials are, has been really helpful. And one of the ways that we do that is to create this Sankey diagram. And Will, maybe I'll let you jump back in here and explain this one.
Yeah, sure. So within this visualization here, we have a projection of the value that can come from implementing regenerative agriculture practices. And this was an analysis that we did with folks over at General Mills. So as a quick orientation to the visual here, on the left-hand side of the visual, we've got a bar that says $38, and that's the average additional cost per acre per year of practices. And from that bar are several colored bars that signify the different types of outcomes that can come from this investment. So what becomes clear pretty quickly is there's a lot of different outcomes that can come from this. And these vary from economic related outcomes, from environmental outcomes. We see an increased carbon sequestration outcome. And across many of these is a social element that's built into the experiences of the long-term impacts of these. So the idea here is that, well, both in continuation from the previous slide, we see that carbon and our goals of reducing carbon can be integrated into many of these nature-based solutions, but in some cases, it's a relatively smaller piece of the total amount of benefits that are being generated. So in many cases, what we like to do as a part of these analyses, especially some of these nature-based solutions, is to highlight that while we may have a very prominent focus on carbon, given how important that is for our future, right? As well as how much it's a part of corporate agendas and the different public-facing commitments that are out there specific to carbon. So that can be where a lot of attention goes and a lot of investment goes, and it can really determine what types of projects companies are investing in. But in some cases, if we're focused exclusively just on the carbon benefit of a project, we may lose sight of all these other co-benefits that can come with it. And in particular, this project is a great example because if we look only at the increased carbon sequestration benefit of about $20 here, that $20 is less than our $38 upfront investment. So if we were focused only on ways to efficiently reduce our carbon, this wouldn't look like a good payoff investment. But once we start accounting for all those other co-benefits, it's like, oh wow, the total value on the table here is immense. And it's cross-cutting for a bunch of different stakeholders that will be experiencing value in many different ways. So for these nature-based solutions in particular, it's really helpful to still have an eye on the carbon benefits that can come from it, but really broaden your view to account for all the potential sources of value that are on the table, because that can really change your perspective of what's a good investment and what's not here. But Ted, is there anything else on the co-benefit side you'd like to touch on?
No, it's great. Thank you.
Cool.
Just a minute.
So tracking, part of all of this work is just first understanding and designing a solution. But over time, you want to know if it's working or not, and if you need to continually improve that, or find another route. So one of the tools that we pull from to help better understand what the dose and fidelity key indicators can be is a logic model. And so the logic model works kind of from top to bottom there. Understanding first the inputs that go into a program, and that would be the building, the staff, the money, how much electricity, or any of the inputs really. The activity itself is whatever is happening. If you're planting trees or teaching kids to read or building a new facility. And the outputs of that are the number of things coming off of this conveyor belt, right? So if you're planting trees, the number of trees, how many acres that's covered, and so on. And because those number of trees have been planted, there are short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. The short-term ones for tree planting might not be as big, but the intermediate, it starts to store carbon, filter water, reduce erosion, and long-term, creates a whole new ecosystem and biome, and continues to help cool that place. And those are what really turn into the systemic impacts that are the goal. And so this logical model helps see, the causal links and why certain portfolios are put together, because you can start to see drop-offs or other risks associated with different programs that could be buttressed by adding another piece to the puzzle. So being able to see what those logical links are is really helpful. And then when I'm talking about dose and fidelity, we do a lot of research, and we find that statistically speaking, these interventions are effective, right? So then at a certain point, you can really back off of understanding all the big data. Like, was it raining that day? Was someone smiling? Did they have a Coke or a Pepsi? Doesn't matter if the trees were planted. We know that 80% of them are going to survive to the 30th year. And if we have this many trees 30 years from now, that will create the change we're looking for. And so the dose and fidelity metric is more like, are the trees still there? Like, have we lost more than 30% of them? And if so, why? Is that big storm came through and knocked them all down when they were saplings and we need to replant, or logging overstepped, or what? But so trying to give everybody an out on the big data need. Yeah, maybe Will, can you speak to Luis?
Yeah, a couple other aspects of tracking systems that we always like to point to and recommend are this the idea of hybrid metrics generally, but one of those metrics is carbon intensity. That's one that I'm sure many of you have seen, and it gets used often, particularly as a part of some of these public-facing commitments, right? So if your organization has done much in science-based targets, SBTI folks will often include a carbon intensity goal as well as an absolute emissions goal. Absolute emissions being just the total amount of emissions that are being generated, right? So carbon intensity can be one of those metrics that helps give you a sense of what's your emissions per output of your company, or per dollar of sales, whichever the metric it may be that you're interested in using there. But that kind of fits into a bigger bucket that is particularly useful, and that's called hybrid metrics. And these are metrics where we're blending an environmental indicator with a financial indicator here. So we've got a couple examples here, this being things like dollars of sales per megawatt hour used, or EBITDA per amount of carbon emissions, right? So the ability to link these two concepts together starts to give you a better sense of how your dual environmental and financial performance is doing over time. And part of the appeal of this is that You know, in many cases, all of these financial metrics are already very well tracked by organizations, right? And a lot of the environmental ones are increasingly tracked as well too, with pretty good data behind them. So as much as we can take those existing systems and work with them to create these types of hybrid metrics that give us this unique line of sight into the that dual environmental and financial performance, that tends to be an easier lift for increasing the adoption and use of these types of figures, and kind of working to build in the value of a nature-based solution into really standard day-to-day practices, right?
Yeah, and I guess one other piece to tag on there, to the hybrid metrics is the idea of growth. If your company is growing, you're probably going to use more carbon, right? So just tracking how much carbon you've produced is not going to show how efficiently you're using it. And so those hybrid metrics allow for that, to kind of decouple just like the rise of carbon from your goals. Yeah, so what's next in the world, looking kind of over the horizon here? One of the things that we bumped into a couple times is idea of a free rider dilemma, or the tragedy of the horizon, and they kind of work in tandem. And the free rider dilemma is one in which corporations have a finite amount of money, and they can't solve their industry's environmental externalities by themselves, but working together also gives their competitors advantage, right? So in agriculture, again, there's an idea of a supply shed, because not one farmer doesn't only sell to one consumer packaged good company. So if that consumer packaged good company asks that farmer to raise their standards or adopt new practices, and they will even invest with that farmer to do that, whoever else that farmer is selling to is also getting that benefit. And so there becomes this hesitation to invest in your competitor's ability to do this, because you're not reaping the benefit of that. There's also an idea that, if you were to make all these investments, but no one else makes any investments in climate change, and all the groundwater dries up, you're still screwed, right? So you could have taken all that investment and eaten it, or whatever, they do with it. And the tragedy of the horizon is kind of in a similar way, like, oh, this is tomorrow's problem. It's the future, and we're dealing with this. This thing's on fire. We need to take that money that we would put into this nature-based solution and put it somewhere else. So I think those two working in tandem can be a pretty slippery slope to inaction, and we want to call that out. So one of the solutions to that is collaboration and investment schemes in, something like that SAP Hub example. There are many different organizations working together across supply chain and across the problem set to understand a solution, and they're all going to benefit from that. And so will everyone who flies the plane that wants to go somewhere for vacation. So, and this kind of all ties together into like a more recent example of like, why aren't insurance companies restoring coastal wetlands? There's some research that shows that the wetlands slowed down Hurricane Sandy and reduced the damage by 10%, when that's $625 million. And I know that here in Minnesota, we've had a lot of hailstorms, and all of our homeowner and car insurance is going up because everyone got new roofs, which is exciting. But the insurance industry itself, I think, has some of the first level risk to the financial fallout of climate change. And it's one of the groups, I think, that can lead the charge in building a coalition, because they are a blanket that lays over everything and could invest with partners as well. But I don't know, Will, any other thoughts here on the horizon?
Well, those are some of the big ones, definitely. So it's a combination of challenges and opportunities, I guess, that we're highlighting here. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the low hanging fruit that we see here is to keep collaborating with groups like the Sustainable Growth Coalition and come to these meetings and talking, because that's how we're all gonna figure out solutions and move forward. You know, look into the opportunities of your own supply chain and value chain to pilot different nature-based solutions. I'm sure there are folks in your supply chain that are already working on this, and you could help scale that or learn from that and then replicate it. Yeah, and try to identify some of those hybrid metrics to better understand the efficiency of your programming and not just the outputs of it, right? So, yep, that's what we have for you.